All right, this review was supposed to be pretty different. I think the C45 is genuinely a good, even top performing paddle, but at the end of our review, we found some issues that make it a lot harder to recommend. So let's talk about it. The Franklin C45 is $229, and after code PB Studio, you can shave that down to $207, and the rest of the specs are as follows. The new C45 models have an average stock weight of 7.6 to 7.9 ounces. Ours was 7.5 out of the box, and I've seen quite a few others that were also around the 7.5 ounce mark as well. On top of that, the swing weights are also very low at 104. So right away, you can tell that this is a paddle that is built to be very, very fast at the net. If I had to guess, this is probably in response to how poorly the heavy FS Tours were received last year, since those had swing weights in about the 133 range. Now, the downside is, since this paddle is so light out of the box, the paddle has a twist weight of 5.42, which is particularly low for any paddle, but especially a hybrid. So that is kind of disappointing to see, but the pro is that since this paddle is so light, there is a ton of room to customize it. Now, this is great for people who love customizing their paddles, but if you don't like customizing, you're probably gonna see this as a huge con. Personally, I don't think it's as big of a con as people make it out to be. If you're someone who really wants or needs a light paddle, this is a good option right here. If you like to tinker and set up the paddle exactly the way you like, then it's also a pro. It's just really not for people who don't like messing around with weight or who don't understand the benefits. I occasionally get comments on the channel that say, why can't companies just make a perfectly balanced paddle out of the box? And the answer is, that just isn't possible to do, because what's perfectly balanced to you could be extremely heavy or even light to another person. There's no one-size-fits-all approach, but I appreciate having the option to set the paddle up the way I want rather than being restricted out of the box. So really, the lightweight just depends on the type of person you are and how you like to view these types of things. Personally, I think it's a big plus. Now I'm going to talk about my weight setup early in this video, because I really think that most people are going to customize this paddle with weight, and I think it's an important aspect of this paddle. I do want to say though, I think it's slightly blown out of proportion how badly this paddle needs weight. Early on testing the paddle, I actually did feel that way, but after testing a brand new one stock and playing around with it versus one that's weighted, I think you definitely unlock aspects of this paddle once it is weighted, but I don't think the paddle is terrible out of the box either. If you told me I had to play it stock, I could probably do it. I would just prefer to slap some weight on it. So I wouldn't stress out too much about that aspect of it, but yes, it is better with weight for most people. I tried quite a few different setups to see what would work. Originally, I tried about 5 inches of 2 gram per inch lead tape at the bottom throats, and this helped the stability. However, the top portion of the paddle felt very dead since it was lacking weight in comparison to the throat, where there was a lot of dense weight. Then I tried 1 gram per inch tungsten tape and did about 8 inches from the throat all the way up the sides. This did feel quite a bit better, but still had a similar issue as the last setup. So I took a 3-inch strip of 1 gram per inch tungsten tape and put it right at the head of the paddle, and this fixed the issue entirely. I think it was just a bit unbalanced having a lot of weight at the sides and the throat and nothing at the head. Once I placed some weight up there, the dead spot at the top portion of the paddle was gone, and the paddle did hit considerably harder as well. Prior to adding that weight, it felt kind of equivalent to a Paddletech Bantam dead spot at the head, and it was really frustrating anytime I clipped a ball near there. After adding that strip, the issue largely went away, and I stopped having any issues. I did also try adding a 9 gram flick weight at the bottom to counterbalance all the weight that I had put in the head, and I largely did it just to try the flick weight out, but in the end, I ended up taking that off the paddle. The final weight of the paddle after this setup was 8.8 ounces for static weight, a twist weight of 6.68, and a swing weight of 117. So even though a significant amount of weight was added, the maneuverability of the paddle was still pretty good. Obviously not like how it was out of the box, but I wouldn't call 117 terrible. Now, the final setup I ended up landing on came from the Franklin website. They actually show how their pros set up their paddles, and Paris had hers set up with 0.5 gram tungsten tape and wrapped the entire paddle, including the handle. Now, you might be saying to yourself, holy crap, that is so much weight. but since it's half gram per inch, it's actually not that heavy. The total weight of the tape ends up being about 0.7 ounces, and the final stats for my paddle were 8.2 ounces for static weight, 114 swing weight, and 6.42 twist weight. And really, those stats are pretty darn normal, even with a lot of weight added. There are plenty of hybrids that are basically in this exact same spec range out of the box. I found this setup made the entire paddle feel more solid, added considerable amount more power, and got rid of all the dead spots that I had been experiencing before. If your goal isn't to keep the paddle as light as humanly possible, this is definitely the setup that I would recommend trying. I actually really ended up enjoying it. The only thing I will also note is that I ended up using 2 overgrips on the paddle just because with 1 overgrip I could feel the weight in the handle, and that wasn't that great. With 2, I felt it a lot less. And now someone did mention in the Discord, why didn't you just use a flick weight instead of putting weight in the handle? Honestly, I was just going to try it exactly how Paris did it and ended up enjoying it, so I didn't really feel like taking it off and then tossing a flick weight under there. But yes, that would probably work just as well too. All right, now let's talk about the performance of the paddle. First, we're going to talk about how it feels, because I think this is one of the more interesting aspects of the C45. I'm going to describe it new first, and then you'll hear how it changed later in the durability section, because there was a big change to ours. Brand new, the paddle feels firm and on the stiffer end, but also feels like the ball kind of sinks into the face more than a stiffer paddle usually would. It's kind of hard and odd to explain because oftentimes stiffer feeling paddles and dwell time aren't exactly two things that go together in the same sentence. But the face feels flexible in a way, but also rebounds and pops off very quickly. I honestly enjoyed how it felt, and it's something that I think you'll just have to try for yourself to kind of see what I'm talking about. No, I wouldn't say it's the highest dwell time paddle on the market or anything like that. In fact, I still think it's less than paddles like a carbon true foam, but it is an interesting dynamic for how rigid the paddle feels. One of the things that stands out as interesting to me with the C45 is the profile of the paddle. It's a poppy paddle, but it doesn't have a lot of plow through or driving power. And this makes sense considering how light it is. But the difference between the pop and power levels in stock form is pretty drastic in my opinion. So I find it can be very offensive at the net, but from the baseline, it isn't necessarily doing a lot of damage. However, once weighted up, that definitely changes, and I would firmly put this in the power category. Plow through and power go up considerably, and the weight really unlocks what you can do with this paddle. Serves, drives, and overheads all become much more aggressive with the final half-gram weight setup. So just know that if you leave it in stock form, you may be leaving some performance on the table. I think the biggest thing I would caution to players is that this isn't going to be a particularly easy paddle to use. I think for players below 4.0, there may be a bit of struggle when it comes to resetting and dinking at the kitchen. Throughout my testing, I found that I had to be just a little bit more conscious of my dinking technique or resets in the mid-court to not pop it up. In stock form, I kind of found the sweet spot to be lacking a little bit, which I think also contributed to some of the dinking and resetting problems, because if you missed off center, there was quite a bit of energy loss. However, once you add weight, I think these issues pretty much go away for the most part. I never really found myself after weight complaining or feeling like, the paddle just didn't really do what I was expecting there, or the ball kind of just died. But definitely in stock form, I think it is on the harder end to use. Maybe not as bad as something like a Selkirk Vanguard Power Air, but I definitely wouldn't call it great. Though the one area, even after adding weight, that I found off-putting was the bottom of the face. Now, I want to be clear. People shouldn't be hitting the bottom of the face. However, when I compare it to some other paddles, the change in feel is very noticeable in the bottom, and the energy is not nearly as much down there. But again, that's to be expected. It was just more so than I found on other paddles that I've played with recently. But the one thing that even after weight, I did find annoying compared to other paddles was the spin. I never really felt like I was getting that great of shape on the ball, and anytime I would go back to something like my Carbon True Foam 2, which has been beat up pretty heavily, the spin difference felt very drastic. There were a lot of times on serves and drives where I just felt like I wasn't getting the dip or the shape that I'm used to, and it just made certain shots feel a little bit more difficult, or I had less confidence in them. Now, I am going to say you might want to take that with a grain of salt, because Isaac thought it was fine for him to shape the ball with, and I've heard plenty of other people say that they get fantastic spin. So whatever it was, I don't know. Could even be my technique, but I just found that it was frustrating for certain shots on a consistent basis. All right, now let's talk about durability and break-in, because this is where things start to go downhill a bit. If you want a full in-depth dissection of these paddles, I would highly recommend checking out John Q Pickleball or Pickleball Medicine, as they both did excellent teardowns on these paddles to show the insides of it. But at a glance, what you really need to understand is that this is a Gen 3 style paddle. They're using some interesting and different manufacturing techniques. However, I'm not really convinced that it's doing anything to make the paddle better or more durable at the moment. There have been 0 Gen 3 paddles that have had long-term durability success, and no reports of core crushing. The 11624 Power Series has done well, but those are still in the early stages, and we'll probably have to wait another month or so to see how they're holding up. We do have one local friend that has managed to start making his crunch a little bit, so we'll just have to see how that shakes out. I say all of this because people need to understand that if you're going to buy any paddle with a Gen 3 foam style enhanced core, they likely just aren't going to last long term. I'm not saying it's impossible for someone to use one for months with no issues, but the likelihood of you having issues or the paddle changing goes up drastically compared to something like a Paddletech Bantam or Engage Pursuit Pro. And our C45 has definitely experienced a variety of different things in the time that it has been used. The first thing that happened very quickly to the paddle was that it started rattling. It's not substantial, but something is loose on the inside of the paddle. Whether that's glue or pieces of the core, I'm not entirely sure, and I'm not going to crucify a brand over some loose glue because honestly, it happens to a lot of paddles. However, what I am going to say is that it's very annoying at the thought of spending $230 for a premium product that is going to start having rattling within a few play sessions. That's just not something you should be experiencing when you're spending that much money. Even our second C45 with less than 3 hours of total play time has started to develop a small rattle as well. The second issue is that our paddle started changing in pitch and feel when hitting the ball, but I didn't notice the power increasing, so I don't think it was due to core crushing. We had our second unit to compare side by side, and if anything, I thought the newer one felt like it was a bit more poppy. The broken in one got more plush and softer feeling and has that louder Gen 3 thunk, while the newer one felt very rigid and stiffer. The best way I can describe it is that the used one felt like there was less tension in the paddle, while the new one felt like it had a lot of tight tension. The final thing actually happened on our last day of play testing and is probably related to the pitch and feel change. The edge guard actually came loose in the top corner, and the carbon fiber face kept poking out over the edge guard. You can see in this clip that I'm actually able to stick a knife blade underneath the face and pry up on it slightly. Usually when an edge guard comes loose, you aren't able to stick a blade under the face and pry it up. This signaled to me that the face may have delaminated, and that's why the sound changed so drastically without the power increasing. A further teardown revealed that the edges must have disbonded from the foam because the putty knife was able to pry up the edges very easily. However, the center of the paddle was significantly harder to pry off. So my hunch is that with the edges disbonding and the center not disbonding, that's what's contributing to the sound change and feel change. Now, Franklin did see my Instagram story about this, and they emailed me saying they still have a less than 1% defect rate and haven't seen many of these issues, and that anything I experienced in this video would be covered under the 1-year warranty. So I'm letting you guys know this to be fair to all parties, and you can decide for yourself what you think about that. I did also have the new and used units x-rayed, and you can see what those look like now. Looking closer at the cells, they actually look pretty healthy overall, and there aren't any major signs of core crushing. And for your reference, our used C45 has about 35 hours of playtime on it. So to wrap this one up, this is tough. Despite this review coming off as probably pretty negative, I actually really did enjoy using the C45. In my opinion, having a lighter stock weight paddle is a plus, even if you have to customize it a bit. I really like that you have the option to set it up the way you want. Sure, Franklin probably could have gone a bit heavier out of the box, and it still would have been fine, but I don't really see it as that big of an issue, and if you are someone who just really loves lightweight paddles, there aren't that many paddles that are top performing in the pop and power categories besides the Paddletech Bantams. While I don't know that the C45 would be my first option to go to a tournament with, I think I could compete and be fine. I think the higher pop is a bit more than I usually prefer, but the paddle was just fun to play with. It was very quick at the net, and when you wanted to finish a ball, it really wasn't an issue. And I also just liked how the ball felt off the face. Outside of durability, my biggest complaint was that I didn't think the spin was that great for me, and that's probably what would hold me back from using it in a tournament. Now, despite really enjoying how the paddle played, would I go spend my own personal money on it? And the answer is no, I wouldn't. And the reason for this is simple. I'm just highly skeptical that this paddle isn't going to have long-term issues. Maybe I truly got the less than 1% dud and got extremely unlucky. But the reason I'm hesitant to believe that is other reviewers have also reported similar issues. Not to mention, if you go back to the Masters at the PPA where the C45 was introduced, the pros paddles all had a sound that was completely ridiculous and isn't how most of these paddles sound stock, which to me indicates that they had a delamination issue similar to mine. I don't know for sure that's what it is, but trying to connect the dots, that's what makes the most sense to me. So if I was spending my own money, no, I wouldn't want to deal with a paddle that after 35 hours of use has these types of issues. Even if I can warranty it, going through that process is just a pain. Now, not everyone has had issues, and certainly not near as drastic as I have. The only really consistent issue I have heard so far is the rattling glue, and then the pitch and feel changing seems to be a bit more random for people. So I guess take it all for what it's worth to you. I think the C45 in terms of performance is a good paddle, and I think it's fun. I just think the durability might not be there. So I would say this is for people who want the absolute fastest hybrid at the net. At a swing weight of 104, there's really not anything that can compete with that, at least in the hybrid shape. It's also for people who love poppy paddles. And then finally, I would say for people who love to customize their paddles and make it exactly how they want, the C45 really allows you to weight this in any way you can imagine. Now, I would say it's not for people who are concerned with durability, people who struggle with the soft game, and if you typically haven't enjoyed 14mm paddles, then I don't think that this is going to be the one to finally sway you to play with one. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.